Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm deeply honored to be here, and if I had any sense at all, I would just congratulate you and sit down. But since it's only fair that you have to sit through one of these as I did 40 years ago, so I will go ahead. Now, loath as I am to giving advice, I know it's expected. So here are 10 things I know now that I didn't know 40 years ago when I sat in those seats. But first I need to explain why Friedrich Nietzsche is up here on the podium with me, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche helped me choose several of the things I will talk about. By the way, Nietzsche's title was Professor Extraordinarius. I don't know if you have that title here at UCSF, but it makes my current title of Professor Emeritus sound pretty puny. So I do have 10 pieces of advice for you, 5 don'ts and 5 do's. I'm going to start with some simple practical advice and then go on to the heavier stuff. The first don't is don't balance your checkbook. It's a complete waste of time. There are 3 types of checkbook balancers. Type 1 people are obsessed and will spend hours tracking down a 3-cent discrepancy. Type 2 people are actually the pathetic ones. They long to be type 1 with a perfectly balanced checkbook, but they're forever backsliding. They begin to envy type 1 people. Every non-sufficient funds notice from the bank is tangible physical evidence of their abject failure as human beings. Then there are the emancipated, the type 3 checkbook balancers. They never balance their checkbooks. Sure, they bounce checks now and then, but think of all the time they save. So here's my advice. If you're a type 1 or a type 2, come to that bright light that is type 3. You are eventually going to end up as a type 3 anyway when you're old and drooling like me, so why not start now while you can still enjoy it? Besides, the nice people at the bank will always let you know if you are writing checks with no money in your account. They're good that way. Okay, the second don't is don't despair when you lose something on your computer. Here's why. 19th century Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle asked his friend John Stuart Mill, who by the way was supposedly one of the smartest people who ever lived, to look over his manuscript on the French Revolution. Later on the fateful night of March 6, 1835, Mill showed up at Carlyle's door and confessed that his maid had used the manuscript to start a fire. There was no copy, it was gone. Years of work down the drain. The next time you lose something on your computer, keep in mind that it couldn't possibly be as bad as what happened to Carlyle. So Carlyle forced himself to write the manuscript again, and it was a huge success. So don't despair when you get the fatal error or the blue screen of death on your computer. It could be a lot worse. Okay, the next don't is practically obligatory for commencement speakers, and it is don't make money your primary goal in life. I'll make this one short because I know you've heard this before. You've heard this 1,000 times. Sure, it's a cliche, but consider the fact that sages from antiquity to the present are aligned on this, and all of the studies within cultures or across cultures agree as well, and all of our experience tells us this. But despite this overwhelming evidence, we cannot seem to disentangle ourselves from the illusion that wealth is required for happiness. It's a constant struggle, but we have to fight it. The next don't is don't be too left-brained. This is an occupational hazard for people who have studied as much science as you all have. For a number of years, I had discussion groups with students at the University of Washington that began with Bertrand Russell's essay, Useless Knowledge. The penetrating clarity of Russell's writing is reason enough to read him, but in this essay, he argued persuasively that professional students needed to spend time in intellectual pursuits outside of their profession. Excellent advice. An egregious example of left brain excess was Danish physicist Niels Bohr, who postponed his honeymoon to work on an exciting idea he had on atomic structure. Theoretical physics trumping conjugal bliss. Any guy listening to this story who doesn't understand why this should be a problem will require a lot of remedial training by his wife. The fifth don't is don't believe everything you think. I'm almost done writing a book entitled The Ignorance of Certainty. Almost no one escapes this foible. On the one hand, smart people are prone to taking their opinions too seriously. They assume that mental horsepower alone allowed them to emerge from Plato's cave into the sunlight, and they are unique in apprehending the true nature of the world. And these people are not just in universities. They're also in barbershops and taxis. They sit next to you on airplanes. They're everywhere. But those with more pedestrian intellectual gifts are also guilty of the ignorance of certainty, and they often fall into the trap of framing complex problems in simple terms. This can be rather dangerous if they happen to be in positions of great power. Fortified with certainty and unencumbered by serious reflection, they gerrymander any set of facts to fit their preconceived notions. One remedy for this is to be honest with yourself about past errors. I have passionately believed many things in my life that later turned out to be palpably untrue. I have misjudged things in every area, from the trivial to the profound. Science, politics, horticulture, map reading, birthday presents for my wife, you name it, I've screwed it up. A central thesis of 16th century French essayist Montaigne was that intellectual humility is inseparable from wisdom. Intellectual humility is inseparable from wisdom. Charles Van Doren summarized Montaigne's thesis very well. Quote, "All of us sometimes, and most of us always, are steeped in a brew of illusions." All of us sometimes, and most of us always, are steeped in a brew of illusions. Okay, we're done with the 5 don'ts. Now let's go to the 5 do's. The first do is to be kind to each other. At the end of a long interview, British philosopher Stephen Toulmin, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, was asked what big problems he still struggled with. He paused and then he said, "Why are people so nasty to each other?" It's a good question. Now a digression before I circle back to my point. Given the talent and intelligence of this group of graduates, many of you will do great things. After all, the Swedish pharmacist Carl Scheele discovered 8 elements and made many other important discoveries. Another pharmacist, Englishman Luke Howard, was the father of modern meteorology. He's the guy who came up with the cloud names like stratus, cumulus, etc. But while some of you will make dramatic contributions such as these to society at large, we all have one common legacy, a legacy that is far removed from our professional accomplishments, our material accumulations, or our standing in society. This legacy is the sum total of all of our interactions with our fellow humans, family, friends, patients, co-workers, neighbors, acquaintances, and yes, even total strangers whose lives cross ours only once. Most of us will vanish without a trace, and 200 years from now, our descendants will be on Ancestry.com trying to figure out who we were. So make the best of your time on Earth by being kind to your fellow travelers. Everything else you accomplish is gravy. The next do is to live dangerously. Now, I'm certainly not talking about climbing Everest or wrestling alligators, and I'm absolutely not suggesting that you cancel your honeymoon to work on a physics problem. Nietzsche urged us to say yes to life, no matter what fate brings. For Nietzsche, seeking comfort and safety resulted only in a wretched contentment, as he called it. It was a great sin in his view. He wanted us to live dangerously. Writer Reynolds Price, from Duke, recounted the words of a woman on her deathbed. She said, "Remember, I only regret my economies. I only regret my economies." My unscientific poll of elderly people tells the same story. When forced to choose, almost all regret things they didn't do rather than the things they did do. Henri Poincaré talks of people, quote, "without curiosity, who shunning excess would not die of disease, but would surely die of ennui," close quote. I've thought about this, and I've decided that I want to die in my sleep like my grandfather did, not screaming and yelling like the people in his car. Okay, the next do is to adopt a contemplative habit of mind. If you are too busy to spend time in reading and contemplation, you are too busy. Some believe that the mental delight of reading and contemplation is the most fun you can have with your clothes on, and I would agree with that point. When looking for wisdom in the written word, look primarily to the past. Little of the thinking that is stylish in any given age will prove to be of lasting value. Look to what has survived from past ages, where time has winnowed the selection for us, and where most of the nonsense has already been discarded. But the point is that we need to spend more time focusing inward. We need to become more centripetal. And it's not just mental delight. There's more practical wisdom in Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca than all of the modern self-help books combined. But one can go too far in the contemplative life. When British philosopher Alfred Ewing was asked what he looked forward to in the next life, Ewing replied, quote, "God will tell me whether there are synthetic a priori propositions." Good grief. The next do is, if you want to have a positive outlook, develop a tragic sense of life. I'll repeat that. If you want to have a positive outlook, develop a tragic sense of life. This is the most important of the 10 pieces of advice. It's the second to last one, but it's also the most important of the pieces of advice that I have for you today. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but recognizing the essential tragic nature of human existence actually improves our outlook, while denying it actually can result in despair. This is one of Nietzsche's central points. Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl credits Nietzsche with giving him the intellectual insights to avoid abject despair during his ordeals. Okay, so how does one develop a tragic sense of life? It requires several insights, but here are 3 of the most important. First, develop realistic expectations. Trying to construct a pain-free life is a fool's errand. As singer-songwriter Mary Chapin Carpenter said, "Sometimes you're the windshield, sometimes you're the bug." Oscar Wilde also knew about realistic expectations. Oscar Wilde was not a fan of Niagara Falls, and during the time that Niagara was a popular honeymoon destination, Wilde observed that Niagara Falls was the second biggest disappointment in every newlywed woman's life. They needed to have more realistic expectations. Okay, so the first step is to develop realistic expectations. The second step in developing a tragic sense of life is to recognize the relationship between suffering and joy. Whole books have been written about this, but I'm going to do it in about 30 seconds. It's a profound paradox. True joy springs not from good fortune, but from rising above our struggles. As poet Khalil Gibran said, "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain." The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. This is highly counterintuitive, but it's almost certainly true. Okay, so step 1 is realistic expectations. Step 2, suffering and joy are inextricable. The third step is to achieve what Viktor Frankl called tragic optimism. He coined that term. The writer Joseph Conrad said, quote, "We begin to live when we have conceived life as a tragedy," close quote. A rather impressive list of other people have come to exactly that same conclusion. The Buddha, Heraclitus, Boethius, Marcus Aurelius, St. Augustine, Pascal, Rousseau, Emerson, Dostoevsky, C.S. Lewis, Jorge Borges, Albert Camus, M. Scott Peck, Reinhold Niebuhr, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and many, many other people have come to that same conclusion. For so many wise people to all come to the same conclusion suggests that we should listen up. Plus, it goes without saying that the absence of pain and suffering would ruin the country western song business. And here are a couple of real songs. "I'm So Miserable Without You, It's Like Having You Here," or another one is "You're the Reason Our Kids Are So Ugly." And my personal favorite, "You Done Tore Out My Heart and Stomped That Sucker Flat." So develop a tragic sense of life. You'll be glad you did.